name is Anthony Grenville. I am an academic. The first part of my career, I taught modern German literature. I have a degree in modern languages. In the second part of my career, I focused more on the history of the Jewish refugees from National Socialism who fled to Britain. The object that I would like to talk about is the last of the Red Cross messages that were sent by my grandparents in Vienna to my mother, it's my mother's parents, in London, before they were deported and murdered. These Red Cross messages were a means established by the Red Cross for people like prisoners of war who were held in enemy territory, to give the briefest of details, a maximum of 25 words, to their families back home. When I was in my 20s, my mother showed me the Red Cross messages that she'd received during the war, and this is the last one. My parents were both Jewish refugees from Vienna who fled to London after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in March 1938. My maternal grandparents were fairly typical of the assimilated, educated, highly cultured section of Viennese Jewry. My grandfather was a very successful lawyer. He ran his own Kanzlei, sort of chambers, as it were. He belonged to a chamber music quartet playing the viola, and I have a photograph of him playing chamber music with Albert Einstein when Einstein came to Vienna in 1931 and played with the chamber music quartet that my grandfather belonged to. Life continued pretty much as normal for them in the years leading up to 1938, although the political situation in Austria became increasingly unstable. Like a lot of Jews in Vienna, they were completely taken by surprise by the Anschluss, and especially by the upsurge of violent anti-Semitism that took place in Vienna on a scale that hadn't been seen previously anywhere in Nazi Germany in 5 years. They only caught up afterwards in the time of the Kristallnacht. So this was a very, very violent and abrupt change in their circumstances. My father never spoke to me about these matters at all, but my mother spoke a little about it. She said that after the Anschluss, she went into my father's office to see him and noticed that he was keeping his hands hidden. And she said, well, is there something wrong with your hands? And he was, as I mentioned, a viola player. He'd been forced to scrub the pavements and his hands were quite badly injured. At first, my mother was able to communicate directly with her parents in Vienna by letter. And they were just sort of family letters, really. After the outbreak of war, that became impossible, but my father set up a post office box in Lisbon, neutral territory, and you were able to send letters there and then on to Vienna. That stopped too, and in about 1941, the Red Cross letters began. They were reduced to communicating by Red Cross letters. Just forms, really, with the sender's name and address, the recipient's name and address, and a short message, strictly limited to 25 words. And those continued up until my grandparents were deported in the autumn of 1942. They had to be very careful because of the censorship and said virtually nothing about living conditions. It was mostly that they were keeping reasonably well, that they were seeing my father's parents, who were also well. But the amount of actual detail is very small. The process of Red Cross messages was two-way, so it enabled not only the person held in enemy territory to communicate with family members abroad, but also the family members abroad to send messages with family news. Strictly censored, of course, so it was very, very neutral, or very personal to the family, and therefore uncontroversial, as it were. The Red Cross message is just one side of paper. It gives the name of my grandfather, Dr. Bernhard Strasberg, with the letters, middle name ISR for Israel, supposed to be a humiliation that was imposed on all Jewish men having to get a middle name of Israel. His address, and my mother, and her address in Finchley in London. The message reads, Letzte Gesundmeldung, Bernhard Flora, August Mitte eingetroffen. The last news we had from Bernhard and Flora, my father's parents, arrived in mid-August saying they were well. In fact, they'd been deported to the ghetto at Łódź and were murdered. Wir beide gesund, we are both well, erwarten unseren Abtransport nach Theresienstadt, October Mitte. We're expecting our transportation to Theresienstadt in mid-October. Theresienstadt, or Teresin, was a ghetto in Bohemia, that is about 70 kilometers north of Prague, where Jews, mainly elderly Jews, were held pending their deportation, mostly to Auschwitz. Sind glücklich über eure guten Nachrichten. We are happy about your good news. Innigste Küsse, heartfelt kisses. My grandfather died in Theresienstadt in February 1943, and my grandmother survived another 15 months before she was deported to Auschwitz and presumably gassed on arrival. My mother actually sent one last desperate Red Cross message to my grandfather's secretary saying, Wo sind meine Eltern? Where are my parents? They'd apparently disappeared off the face of the earth. And this lady very courageously, I thought, replied, saying, I don't know. I don't think they had any idea. The photo and the Red Cross message, of course, mean a lot to me because they're my contact with that part of my family's history which has been pretty much expunged. As I've got older, these things have come to mean a lot more to me.